cases and controls may differ in characteristics or exposures other than the one that has been targeted for a study. What do I mean? For example, you can see sometimes, for example, based on the result, more cases have been exposed than have controls. It means that the proportion of exposure is higher among cases. But most of cases are poor and most of controls are rich. You may tell me that it is not related to the exposure of interest. It is related to the socio-economical status of those cases and controls. I mean that, for example, I want to assess the relation between, for example, diabetes and hypertension. Okay, hypertension is my exposure, and diabetes is my disease. And after the study, I show you that the percentage of hypertensive population among diabetes is higher. For example, these patients have 20% of hypertension, and they have 5%. And you tell me that there is a direct association between hypertension and diabetes. Why? Because the percentage of exposure, that is hypertension, among cases are higher. But I tell you that the mean age of diabetic population is, for example, 56, and the mean age of healthy population is, for example, 13. We know that if the age is increased, the probability of having diabetes is higher. So the reason of hypertension, and also hypertension is higher among older population. So the reason of having hypertension among diabetic patients is not associated with diabetes. It is associated with their age. How can you answer to this question and solve this problem?
By making sure that the people who we select for the case and for the control are all similar. Similar in age, similar in work, and in where they live, and in what socio-economic.
The budget also.
In this situation, age is a factor that make my result challenging. Yes?
Yes.
So in this example, it is better to have the same distribution of age, and we want to have the same mean age in diabetes and non-diabetes population. Okay? So if we have a way to balance age between cases and controls, we can have the same mean age, for example, 30 and 30, and if we can show you that the prevalence of hypertension among diabetic patients is higher than non-diabetic, at that moment we can say that it is related to exposure. Okay? So we should make the distribution of age similar to cases and controls. It is matching. It means we can match the patients with the controls, regarding of age in this example. If I have a diabetic case that is, for example, 60, we can select a control that is 60. If we have a patient that is 40, we can select a control that is 40. So finally, the mean age in cases and controls would be the same. So if at that scenario, we can show you that the percentage of exposure among cases and controls are different, it is true. It is not related to the third factor. Okay? It is matching. Sometimes we can match regarding gender, regarding sex. For example, if we think that diabetes are more prevalent among women, okay? And finally, after the study, for example, 60% of diabetic patients are women, but in healthy population, 20% are women. So we cannot say that our result is true. Why? Because the sex distribution is totally different in our cases and controls. So by matching sex, we can select a control with the same sex of each case. If the case is women, the control could be women. But how many factors can be matched between sexes and cases and controls? Can we match, for example, for 6 factors simultaneously? For example, we want to match sex, age, for example. Sex, age, for example, race, socioeconomic status, and, for example, region of living. Okay? If we have a man, elderly, black, affluent, living in, for example, city, we should have a control who is man, elderly, black, for example, affluent, and live in city. It is so difficult. We cannot wait to find an exact control with these characteristics. So we just match for 1 or 2 or maximum 3 factors. Okay? So it is a type of matching. If we try to match on several factors, the cases and controls could be similar to each other, so similar, and we cannot find any difference among them. If you find somebody who is matched regarding these factors, he is so similar to the other group. For example, in that way, the nutrition might be the same because the socio-economic status and the living area, or for example, the age, the race, are similar, so the other factors might be similar as well, because two groups are so similar to each other, and you cannot find any difference between these two. It is a type of error that is overmatching. We try not to do overmatch, but match is a very good solution to combat with confounding factor. Age, in this example, named as confounding factor, that confound and make an error in our result. Okay? So, if I ask you, what is matching? You can answer that matching is a way to control the third factor that might interfere our results. Okay? Is it clear? What is
so matching of cases and controls, it's mainly like we have to summarize all the factors and make just only one variable, right?
not all the factors, just important factors. 1, 2, or maximum 3 factors. For example, if we want to work on the effect of, for example, smoking and cardiovascular disease, not effect, I mean the association. The association between smoking and cardiovascular. Okay? How can we control the effect, the noisy effect of age, I mean? We can stabilize the cases and controls. We can match the age through these two groups. Okay? The other important factor for the relation between smoking and cardiovascular could be sex. Okay? So we can match based on sex and based on age. Okay? And after that, we can say that, okay, there is no difference between age in case groups and control groups. So, if there is any association between smoking and cardiovascular disease, it is not related to the difference of age. Why? Because the age is the same in these two groups. Okay? I told you overmatching. Overmatching is good or bad? Bad. Why?
Yeah.
Two problems. One,
You have a lot of problem to deal with it, so it take a long time to
very good. One problem is being time consuming,
consume.
because we cannot find a
All
person who is matched with considering several
the same,
factors.
yes.
Okay? The other problem,
These confounding factors, age, sex. These confounding factors like age, maybe they maybe not match with case.
overmatching. What is the problem of overmatching? The first one is time consuming, and the second one is making two similar groups that are so similar to each other, and we cannot find anything. I told you that if we match two groups based on these several factors, for example, the nutrition might be similar as well, because their race, their culture are similar based on cases and controls. Their ages are similar, their socioeconomic status are similar, so the other factors that are not matched are actually matched by themselves.
Mm.
We did not match those factors, but based on these similarities, those factors might be matched with each other, and we cannot be able to show the differences between these two groups. Okay?
Yes.
Is it clear? So these two are the main disadvantages of overmatching, and we should be cautious to avoid overmatching in our case control studies. One of the main disadvantages of case control studies are problems of recall. What is the main way of finding association in control study? Asking about the previous history. Because based on the difference between prevalence of exposure in cases and controls, we want to find association. Yes? Sometimes, and what is the way of determining exposure? Recalling. Yes? We rely on the memory of patients and controls. We ask them about the previous history of, for example, some exposure. Did you have exposure with, for example, X-ray? Did you have exposure with smoking or something like that? Sometimes we have some limitations in recall. Both cases and controls cannot remember accurately. So if the limitation is in both cases and in controls, we may dilute the association. Why? Because they cannot remember and they cannot answer to our questions correctly. But sometimes we have recall bias. It is more stronger. What do I mean? The degree of the limitations is not the same in cases and controls. I mean that cases try to remember and force themselves to remember, but for controls, it is not important. So, cases answer to your questions very effectively, but controls do not care. Please, let me make an example for you. We have two groups of mothers. One group has malformed infants, okay, and one group of mothers have healthy infants. We want to assess the exposure of, for example, viral infection during pregnancy among mothers. The mothers with malformed infants try to remember all diseases that they had during pregnancy. Yes? Because they blame themselves for having such a malformed infant. But the mothers with healthy infants do not care. They do not try to remember all exposures that they had. Yes? So, in mother with malformed infant, they try to think about the previous history, and they also mentioned all sneezes and problems that they had. Even the symptoms were related to allergia or something like that. But those mothers are responsible to remember all things, true or incorrect. But the mother of that group, of that healthy infants, even forgot the real and exact diseases that might they had. Yes?
Yes.
So, based on the difference, you cannot rely on the information that are provided by mothers of these two groups. It is a kind of recall bias. And you cannot find in which direction your result is deviated. If there is diluted or if there is exaggerated. Okay? So it is a kind of bias that might be happen in case control study. The other name of this type of bias is rumination bias. Okay? Recall bias or rumination bias. If we want to name the advantages of case control study, 1. Please review the characteristics of case control studies and name the advantages and disadvantages.
The advantage.
Is it good for rare diseases or not?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Why? Because
Because
I
we'll
told
definitely
you-
have a large population of those with diseases, and we can select. We want to see these people who have diseases come here.
very good, very good. Is it time consuming or not?
No.
If done in the hospital, if done in the hospital, no. But if we want to take a control group from outside the hospital, then yes, it becomes time consuming, especially when we want to get many specific factors which you mentioned there.
In
So-
prevalent case,
Is it better if we take our, like, the case and control outside the hospital?
it depends. Your classmate asked me about what is the best and most suitable control groups, and I told him that there is no specific appropriate group. It depends on your objective, on your study. Okay? You should try to think about all errors that might be happened and select the best appropriate control groups based on your study objectives. Okay? The other, please think about the example that I made you about breaking a window. I told you that if you see that the boy is throwing a stone and you see that the intact glass is broken, it is a kind of risk factor. It is the other type of study that is court study, and we want to review it in the next session. It means that you start with exposure. In case control study, you start with case and control. You start with disease. But in that design, you start with exposure and wait to have the disease in the future. It is so time consuming and needs more period. But compared to that design, case control is less time consuming. Okay? The other thing about costs. Is it
Because
expensive or
Yeah.
not?
expensive.
Expensive.
Some of them. Some of them is expensive.
Some of them. Okay, but compared to the other court studies, it is cheaper.
Mm.
Why? Because you have cases and controls, and you want just to ask them about the previous history of exposure. Okay? Is it good for rare exposure or not?
Yes.
Rare exposure. We have rare exposure, we have rare disease. For rare disease, is it
Good.
appropriate?
It
Is
is.
it good? But for rare disease, for rare exposure, is it good or not?
I think we don't have more information about rare approaching, so it's not effective.
Is not effective.
No,
We
it
can
is
ask.
effective.
Because the logic of case control studies is asking about the previous history of exposure, so we can ask them.
I think we don't know is that exposure is the main reason for this disease, or there another exposure. So we cannot know.
Please let me make a real example in which you can find the answer. Okay? I want a disease. All of you are healthy, I hope. For example, migraine. Okay, headache. Okay,
Before the
you have migraine.
No, I have disease. I'm more about the exam.
It is very good disease.
Oh,
Be sick.
I want treatment.
Treatment,
Yeah.
something more.
It's difficult to me.
No problem. More and more. It has treatment. Okay. Migraine, for example, headache. For example, some of you have suffered from migraine, and some of you have not. Okay? So some of you are cases, and some of you are not. My hypothesis is association between exposure with asbestosis and migraine.
What is asbestosis?
It is a chemical substance. Okay? Asbestosis. Okay. How many? It is important to find the previous history, the percentage of previous history of exposure with asbestosis, and compare the prevalence between cases and controls. Okay? How many of, for example, you assume that you are cases and you are controls. How many of you have experienced exposure with asbestosis?
Well, I assume two of us.
No one.
No one. No, actually,
Okay.
no one.
No.
How many of you have experienced with asbestosis?
No.
No one. 0%? Zero. Oh, there is no association between asbestosis and migraine. But it is not true, because exposure is so rare. And if you want to work on rare exposure, you cannot rely on the result of case control.
We don't have enough data.
Because there is no difference between 0 and 0.
Zero to zero.
Or maybe, for example, you have one person and you have no. Is there any difference between 1 and 0? No. So, for rare exposure, we cannot use case control study. Okay? But for rare disease, it is very good. Okay? How about number of disease and number of exposure.
I will look at it on
I want
4 to 1. The
no,
highest.
number of controls and number of cases, no. Number of diseases and number of exposure.
exposure.
If we select cases and controls at the first of the study, we cannot change the disease of interest.
Yes.
We want to work on, for example, leukoplakia carcinoma. So the disease is fixed, but we can change the exposure. In our questionnaire, we can ask about smoking, we can ask about hypertension, we can ask about, for example, X-ray, we can ask
So we have
about...
infinity exposure. Infinity
Yeah, very good. There is no limitation in the number of exposure that we are examining. Why? Because exposure is wide. We can just fix the disease, but we have no limitation in the number of exposure that we are asking from our cases and controls. Okay?
Yes.
So the advantage
Can we
is...
get like vaccine against the exposure?
Again,
Vaccine.
vaccine?
Yeah. Like against the
What is
exposure.
the relation between this question with our class? I
Yeah,
cannot.
that's-
Please explain more.
The exposure will make the disease. So the exposure are around us, like the disease, and we have virus. The virus will attack in the body. So if we get like some barrier or like anything to protect our body,
Yes.
so we can.
What is your question? What is your research
Like,
question?
yeah, we have like barrier. We will not get like exposure. You say it's impossible
Yes.
because around.
Yes, it is important. It is an important issue in preventing disease. But in our case control study, for example, regarding vaccine and the disease, sometimes there is a hypothesis, I've heard about it, that exposure to some vaccines may produce, for example, a specific disease. For example, dementia. No? In this scenario, we may have, for example, early onset dementia and healthy population and ask about the exposure to vaccines among them. In case control study, you should have a hypothesis about the relation between a specific exposure and a disease. In this scenario, my disease is early onset dementia, and exposure, for example, is exposure with hepatitis B vaccine, for example. You may answer to this question using a case control study. Okay? But that scenario that you were raised is not related to the case control study. It is a problem of public health. I cannot understand your meaning. If you ask any more, if you want to have the answer, please let's explain a little more. Okay? I can answer to your question after the class if you remain. The question is remained. Okay? So please review. Well suited for rare diseases. Okay? Well suited to the study of diseases with long latency. What does it mean?
Like to remain in the body for longer, latency, to develop in the body for a long period of time.
For example, if exposure with asbestosis developed, produced disease 30 years later, we cannot follow for 30 years. Yes? But if we have, for example, some disease population and some healthy population, we can ask about the previous history of exposure at home. Okay? And relatively inexpensive, require shorter time compared to the cohort study, requires few subjects, the sample size is somehow less compared to the cohort study, and allow multiple potential causes of a disease. Why potential causes of a disease? Why we cannot say risk factor or cause of a disease?
Why multiple, you mean?
No. Not by multiple. About potential risk factor or causal risk factor.
Because
I
for
told-
longer latency, because we can be sure that for something that has a long latency will cause the problem. So, for example, with your example with asbestos, we're not sure that, for example, 30 years down the line, the person who was exposed to asbestos will have.
Cannot remember.
Yes, that's why it's potential cause. We can say, potentially this will cause a problem, but we're not sure because it takes more time. We have to observe this over multiple generations.
Yes. And the other important thing, do you remember the bias that I have mentioned in cross-sectional study regarding smoking and diabetes? Recall bias is related to this. No. I told you that then you have disease and healthy population and ask about the history of exposure, you cannot make certain that if exposure was started before disease or not. It is temporality. Temporality means exposure comes before outcome. We have two groups, diabetics and non-diabetics. Okay? And we ask about the previous history of smoking. But we do not know the exact time of being patient, being diabetic. If smoking came before diabetes or after that, we cannot say anything about the priority of exposure to outcome, such as the broken window, the broken glass. So, in case control study, we cannot say that smoking is cause of diabetes in that scenario. It is potential risk factor, or it is associated with diabetes. Okay? If we want to say something about causal effect, we should go to the next session to find cohort study that is more stronger and make us able to provide information about the causal association. Okay? But what about limitations? One, recall bias. Do you remember?
Yes.
The main important limitation. Not suitable for rare exposures. We have reviewed. Please remember the exposure of asbestosis. Or, for example, atomic bomb exposure. None of us have exposure with this type of exposure. Okay? So, for rare exposure, we cannot use case control study. Potential sources of biases such as recall bias. Difficult selection of controls. It is a limitation of case control study. I showed you an example in John Hopkins Hospital
Yes, all
that's
tuberculosis.
using a bad and unsuitable control group. The results was wrong. Okay, so identifying and assembling a case group that is representative for case group in the community is difficult, and more difficult is identifying an appropriate control group that is representative for the control group in the society. Okay? These are limitations of case control study. In summary, we are here as researchers. We begin with some sick patients and some healthy patients, cases and controls, and we ask them about history of exposure. Some of them have exposure, some of them do not have, and also for these healthy population. And we can compare the percentage of exposure in cases with controls. Okay? Let me ask a question. If the percentage of exposure in cases is significantly higher than the controls, it means that exposure is potential
Cause of disease.
cause or risk factor. But sometimes you may find significant less proportion of exposure in cases compared to controls.
Then it's unrelated. It's unrelated.
Unrelated, but it is significantly correlated. But the direction is inverse. What does it mean?
Oh, the more exposure, the less disease.
Very good. The direction is inverse. What does it mean? Sometimes exposure is good. For example, physical activity.
Yes.
If the exposure is physical activity, higher physical activity, lower disease. So, it depends on the exposure that you work with. Okay? Sometimes there is no association. It means that the prevalence of exposure in cases and controls are the same. It is not statistically significant. It means that there is no association between exposure and disease. Sometimes the exposure is higher among cases and is lower among controls. It means that higher exposure, higher chance of disease. It is direct association. Okay? And sometimes higher exposure, lower disease. It is inverse association. Okay? That's it. The case control study is finished. And we are going to review the next session after a small quiz, after lunch. After your small quiz, you are free. You can go